When we talk about style with programming languages, we're moving away from the rules of how you must and must not write JavaScript into more of how you should and shouldn't write it. So how should you name your variables? Where should you put your braces? What should you call your functions? And where should they be placed in your code? Because this matters. Style decisions matter for you and for other developers on your team. You want your code to be readable, you want it to be consistent, and you also kind of need to play along with how everyone else in the world is writing their JavaScript, because that's going to make it easier to read example code and read books, and more importantly, recognize whether that code is written well. And style matters simply because JavaScript is the most publicly viewable programming language in the world. Unlike a desktop application, with JavaScript running on a web page, all your code is sent to whoever requests it. Every client's browser gets a copy of your JavaScript in plain readable text. Sure, most people won't look at it, but they could. They can view source, they can use tools like Firebug to get to it. Other web developers can see how you write your code. So think of all the JavaScript you write as effectively being published on the web and get into good habits early. So what are these good habits? Well, let's begin with some naming conventions. We get to choose names for variables, functions, even objects if you define your own objects. Now, the rules of JavaScript say you must use letters, numbers, $, and underscore, and you can't start with a number. But that doesn't mean that something like this would be a good name for a variable. We want clarity, we want readability, we want meaning. Yes, okay, when we're learning, we use placeholder names a lot. var A, var B, var C. X is a pretty common one, or common meaningless words like foo or bar. But our real JavaScript variables will represent meaningful information. The name in a text box, a date, the height and width of an image, or a collection of element nodes that represent the links in a menu. So naming conventions have developed over the years, and these days the dominant way JavaScript is written is this. Variables and functions, which will be most of what you name yourself, are written in camel case. The word would start lowercase. If it's just one word like score, it would be all lowercase. But with multiple words, you capitalize the first letter of each subsequent word, like the hump of a camel. Multiple words are not separated with underscores as they might be in some other programming languages. Functions are named the same way, or methods if they're in an object. Now, these are typically multiple words for clarity, and often in a loose verb-noun format. Think of the way that we work with the DOM. Create element, append child, get element by ID. When you're working with objects, the convention here is to also capitalize the first word. And quite often objects only are one word. Think of the way we've seen objects in JavaScript, like the math object and the date object and the array object. Now bear in mind, we still use camel case too. After all, you create a variable that uses camel case that's based on an object that capitalizes the first letter. Now, if you're coming from a language that uses underscores a lot or prefixes variables with an abbreviation that's meant to represent the type of information, you can argue against camel case as much as you like. There is nothing stopping you from using your favorite naming style. But camel case is the dominant style for JavaScript. It's what's recommended by the Yahoo style guidelines, by the Google style guidelines. It's what's used by the popular JavaScript libraries like jQuery and Prototype. And of course, it's what's used by the DOM methods themselves. There is no escaping camel case in JavaScript. Let's talk about brace style, where to put the opening and closing curly braces. Well, the dominant style in JavaScript is the most traditional brace style for C-based languages. If you have an if statement or a while loop, the curly brace opens on the same line as the keyword, as the if or the while or the for. The code is indented inside the block, and the closing curly brace is on a line by itself. If you're adding an else to an if statement, you'll typically see that continued on the same line, again with the opening curly brace of the next section on the same line as the keyword. Now, there are other ways, like Pascal or Ullman style, where the opening brace is on its own line and lines up with the closing brace. But I avoid this style in JavaScript. Now, while it wouldn't matter in most languages, in JavaScript you can run into a situation with JavaScript's own ability to insert what it thinks are missing semicolons on lines that don't have them. It's a rare issue, so I'm not going to get into specifics, but if I use the style on the left, I don't have to worry, and it is the standard style. So for all your ifs, your whiles, your functions, all of these constructs, open the curly brace on the same line as the keyword, the while, the for, or the function. And while we're talking about blocks of code, as in other C-based languages, if you have, say, an if statement that only does one thing, you can technically remove the curly braces. If there's one statement after the if and the condition, it behaves as if there are curly braces around it. But as in other C-based languages, it's a really bad idea to do this because later on, it's super easy to add a line of code to this. And when you read this code, what you think you're getting is this kind of block, where if x is more than 500, we're going to execute these two lines. But if we left the braces off, what we're actually getting is this. If the condition is true, we will pop up the alert, and we will always then go ahead and reset everything. And these kind of bugs can be a real pain to recognize, so always use the curly braces even for one-line blocks. Now, another general rule here is even though you don't have to define your functions before you call them, so for example here, I've got one function called SomeFunction that called otherFunction, and otherFunction is actually defined after it in our code file. The preference and the best practice is to define your functions before they are called. In some languages, you have to do this. In JavaScript, you don't have to, but it does make for more readable, more usable code. So to review, we can really keep a few simple rules in mind. Use camel case for variables, functions, and methods, and this will be the majority of what you have to name yourself. Open curly braces on the same line as the keyword. Always use blocks, even if there's only one line. Define your functions before you call them. And a couple of things we've been talking about along the way. Always use semicolons to end a statement, even if you might not have to, you should. And always use var when declaring a variable. We could go deeper than this with style, but that's enough to get us started. If you do want to go deeper and more formal, do a search for the phrase JavaScript style guidelines, and you'll find some really good documentation that have been created by the JavaScript developers at places like Yahoo and Google and Mozilla. Now, I don't have a personal favorite, but if you're after something more formal, just take a look at these and be consistent about the way you write your code.